By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled, here once the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world. A new nation was given birth with the firing of that single shot, and the valiant men who stood there have been forever honored in those stirring words of Ralph Waldo Emerson. The untrained but dedicated men who fought the British from Lexington and Concord all the way to their final victory at Yorktown were no match for the redcoats in military might. But most of them were experienced riflemen, and in that category were more than equal to their foe. The heroic efforts of these citizen soldiers are still celebrated. The fact that there was an armed citizenry in those days has long been recognized as having played a major role in gaining our freedom and independence. The document drafted in Philadelphia's Independence Hall established a constitutional republic to safeguard the recently won freedom and independence. A union of separate and sovereign states, with certain limited powers delegated to a federal government. Thus was formed a government that was to be the servant of the people rather than ruler over them. Patrick Henry was but one of many great patriots of the day who felt that too much power was being concentrated in the new central government. So an early order of business was the adoption of a series of amendments to further define the limits of the powers being granted. These first 10 amendments are known as the Bill of Rights. The second of these amendments proclaims a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The importance given to this right to keep arms may be judged by the fact that it is placed next in order after freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition, but before such rights as those against unreasonable search and seizure, self-incrimination, and secret trials. The pioneer spirit of the brave men and women who pushed the frontier westward rested on the virtues of self-reliance, courage, and fortitude, backed by the determination and means to protect one's person, family, and property. When these hardy pioneers set out to conquer the wilderness, they carried their firearms with them, thus adding to the already well-established American tradition of self-reliance and preparedness. Still today, providing for the defense of home and family is a basic responsibility of the individual citizen. The wise citizen prepares to meet this responsibility. So obvious a comment should be unnecessary, but in these strange times, such simple truths are often dismissed and all but forgotten. It was George Washington who said,
"To be prepared for war is one of the most effectual means of preserving peace."
With equal accuracy, he might have said that to be prepared for the lawless is one of the most effectual means of preserving law and order. Today, the mass media of communications are pouring forth an incredible barrage of anti-gun propaganda. A propaganda barrage that attempts to use emotion, distortion, and hysteria to influence the thinking of the American people, and it is reaching epic proportions. A feature article, Gun Control Now, appeared in the August 1968 issue of Reader's Digest. Its circulation over 28 million copies in 13 languages. It deplores the increase in the number of crimes involving guns, but by implication, the finger of responsibility is pointed at the law-abiding citizen who hunts and keeps firearms for that purpose, the law-abiding citizen who collects guns for their historic, aesthetic, or intrinsic value, and the law-abiding citizen who has firearms for the protection of his home and his loved ones. The villain seems to have become anyone who has a gun, rather than the criminals and irrational people who misuse guns. The caption above this cartoon might be rather amusing, but for the fact that it has a ring of familiarity. The thief was probably simply the victim of a heartless society. But the homeowner, he should have known that in our modern society no one needs a gun. In his newsletter of June 17, 1968, California State Senator John G. Schmitz expressed the same concern felt by many knowledgeable Americans over the emotion-inspired demand to take away the guns. Senator Schmitz pointed out,
"It is argued that disarmament of law-abiding Americans through restrictive gun laws would greatly reduce the frequency of violent crime, though in fact it would put our good citizens at the mercy of criminals."
Violence strikes and flourishes where it meets no opposition, and is most effectively prevented and curbed when met head-on. Vast portions of San Francisco lay in ruins after the disastrous earthquake and fire of 1906. The city was under martial law, and orders were issued that looters were to be shot on sight. No one thought this was unusual, and there was remarkably little looting. When looting, burning, and rioting erupted in Washington, D.C. during April 1968, police were ordered by their politician superiors not to interfere, and the violence raged on for several days. Halfway across the nation in Chicago, arsonists and rioters set the torch to large portions of the city. When the mayor suggested that police be permitted to shoot arsonists and looters if necessary to stop the Holocaust, the wailing and weeping of the bleeding hearts over such inhumanity was heard across the land. The bleeding heart shed no tears for the victims, those who may have been burned to death in the fire set by the arsonists, or the small merchants who lost everything to the looters. The cry was, no matter what suffering they inflict, no harm must come to the criminals. This attitude makes it nice and cozy for the criminals, but just a little hard on the honest citizens who are the victims. This same attitude is apparent in many recent court actions and decisions. It appears that the criminal is to be treated as tenderly as possible, as if he's become a natural resource to be protected in every way possible. This leaves the responsible citizen to feel more and more that the defense of his family and his home has come to depend upon his own abilities and means. Unfortunately, with increasing regularity, honest citizens are having to provide such defense. The Pike County Democrat-Times tells of the gallant actions of Mrs. Frank Rodhouse, who with her 4 daughters returned home one evening to be met inside by a shotgun-armed intruder. The intruder forced the family upstairs and tied Mrs. Rodhouse to a chair in a separate room. Mrs. Rodhouse was able to slip her bonds after he left the room. She then went to the chest of drawers and got a pistol and some cartridges. She then slipped quietly downstairs where her son was tied up, and he showed her how to load and fire the pistol. She went back upstairs, and in one of the bedrooms she found the intruder now naked and about to attack her 13-year-old daughter. She called to him to stop, but the criminal grasped his shotgun and turned toward Mrs. Rodhouse. She fired 3 shots, and the man fell to the floor mortally wounded. This woman saved herself and her family because she was prepared and able to do so. This is but one of the countless numbers of similar incidents. If all the demands of the anti-gun fanatics become realities, self-protection by the citizen would become an impossibility. For when registration and licensing prove ineffective in curbing the rising tide of violence, surely they will demand confiscation next. In their juggling of figures and statistics, the anti-gun fanatics show themselves to be either lacking in knowledge on the subject of gun fatalities or very devious. One of their most used claims is that in 1966 alone, 19,500 Americans were killed by guns. Let us look at this shocking total of 19,500 in more detail and see just how it is reached. First, 10,400 were suicides. Over 53% of the deaths were instances in which an irrational person used a gun to end his own life. One need not be a mental giant to realize that very little can be done about such personally inflicted fatalities. For anyone intent on taking his life can find many effective and adequate means readily at hand. Lacking a gun, he will simply use one of these methods, as do so many others. An additional 2,600 of the deaths were the results of accidents involving firearms. Many of these tragedies could have been avoided if more people took advantage of the training courses in the safe handling of firearms regularly offered by many organizations and groups interested in guns. 1,000 of these gun accident fatalities occurred outside the home. This number is a bit more meaningful when one realizes that during this same period there were 4,500 deaths by accidental drowning of persons swimming, playing, or falling into water. This does not include those drowned on home premises or at work, and excludes drownings involving boats. Also, for every fatal gun accident in the home, there were 8 persons who died in falls in the home. We have no desire to de-emphasize the number of tragedies in which guns play a part, but statistics can be misleading unless viewed in a manner that is realistic and meaningful. Of the 19,500 victims of guns in 1966, 6,500 were homicides. This is 33% of the firearm fatalities, and all people of good conscience are concerned about how this terrible toll can be reduced. More vigorous application of existing laws against those who misuse guns could reduce this figure. The barrage of propaganda coming from the anti-gun zealots condemns the guns and attacks all who have guns. But amid this increasing flood of statistics, proposals, and claims, one very significant item is missing. The anti-gun fanatics offer no examples. No, not one single victim who would have been saved by their proposals. Incredibly, it is only the potential victims who would be hampered by their proposals. The recent murders of these three prominent public figures have provided the emotional trigger for the anti-gun zealots and a flood of proposed gun legislation. Let us examine each of these cases in order to determine how more gun legislation might have prevented their occurrence. The Marxist communist Lee Harvey Oswald had no criminal record and had not been declared to be mentally incompetent. He could have purchased his mail-order rifle in any firearm store in the nation, even under the registration and licensing standards being proposed. He could have then used it in just the same manner. What kind of legislation would have stopped Oswald? Probably none. But this frequently seen sign that reads, "Register communists, not firearms," brings some possibilities to mind. Unfortunately, recent U.S. Supreme Court actions have effectively destroyed any positive actions along those lines. James Earl Ray, accused of the slaying of Martin Luther King, is a convicted felon, and as such would already be in violation of existing federal laws by having a gun of any kind. What kind of gun legislation would be obeyed by those who choose to ignore even the present laws? We should also note that Sirhan Sirhan, accused of the murder of Senator Robert Kennedy, was already in violation of a number of existing federal and California gun laws. Among these were possession of a firearm by an alien, carrying a concealed weapon, carrying a loaded weapon in an incorporated area, and carrying a loaded weapon in a public place. Sirhan ignored all of these laws, and it seems unlikely that he would have observed any others. Violence occasionally strikes prominent public figures, but it is the innocent, insignificant, law-abiding citizen upon whom the heavy hand of tragedy most often falls. Brutal and senseless acts that extract a terrible toll of human misery. Let us look for a moment at some of the more notorious tragedies. First, the slaying of 8 young student nurses in Chicago by Richard Speck. This tragedy shocked the nation. So let us ask, what gun laws would have stopped Speck? Does anyone even remember what gun he used? No, of course not. He didn't use a gun. A knife and his bare hands were adequate for his victims, had no means of self-protection. Let us look at the Texas University massacre. Here, guns were used by a deranged young man to take the lives of 14 persons. Surely this would be an excellent example to justify gun registration and the licensing of gun owners at the very least. Again, no. Charles Whitman obviously did not believe in obeying gun laws, for in his arsenal was a sawed-off shotgun, illegal under federal laws for over 30 years. Laws did not stop or even inconvenience Whitman, and additional laws would not have helped. In broad daylight, a madman entered this public restroom in New York Central Park and shot to death an innocent young woman. He then climbed to the roof, from which he shot another passerby and 2 policemen before his rampage was ended. What gun laws would have stopped Angel Angeloff? He was already in violation of the stiffest gun control legislation in the United States, New York's well-known Sullivan Law. New York's Sullivan Law was enacted in 1911 and was named for Big Tim Sullivan, a powerful Tammany Hall politician of that period. This law made it a criminal offense for law-abiding citizens to have a handgun, even within the sanctity of his own home, unless he had permission from the local bureaucrats. One of the earliest challenges of this incredibly restrictive law was the case of People versus Warden of City Prison. Not too surprisingly, the forces of government prevailed. But the eminent New York Supreme Court jurist, Justice Francis M. Scott, pointed out in his penetrating and scholarly dissenting opinion that
the professional criminal will generally violate the act and take his chances of discovery and punishment, while the law-abiding citizen will be obliged to disarm himself of his only effective protection against the predatory classes. The best police force in the world cannot always or even usually anticipate and prevent crimes of violence. They can and usually do preserve peace and order, and sometimes discover the perpetrators of crimes, but they can seldom prevent. A law-abiding citizen in his walks abroad can usually avoid dangerous localities, but in his own house he can never be entirely secure against the midnight marauder. For protection there, he is compelled to rely upon himself and upon such means of defense as he may have at hand.
The New York Times, a powerful and influential voice even in those days, had been a very vocal proponent of the Sullivan Law. But just months after its enactment, even they were admitting that it was a failure. In the article which appeared on Saturday, May 24th, 1913, they said that the concealed weapon law has not worked as well as was expected, or at any rate hoped, by those of us who commended it in principle, if not in all its details, is a fact too obvious for denial. Criminals are as well armed as ever, in spite of the sternness with which the law has been applied to a few of them, while there has been a rather general impression among honest men, mistaken but nonetheless deprived, if not of the means, at least of the right to have the means for defending themselves and their property. That was over 50 years ago, but the Sullivan Law is still in effect in New York. How effective has this law been in protecting the citizens of New York by disarming the criminal element? An analysis of official FBI statistics provides the answer. During 1967 in New York City, the crime rate in the three categories in which guns are generally used, murder, aggravated assault, and robbery, was 548.6 per 100,000 population. Even with the Sullivan Law, or possibly even partially because of it, this crime rate of 548.6 per 100,000 is 85% higher than the rate in Dallas of 296.6 per 100,000 population in the same category of crimes, murder, aggravated assault, and robbery. Of course, a vastly larger percentage of the citizens of Dallas still have their firearms and thus the means to provide for their own self-protection against the criminal elements. There are presently some 20,000 federal, state, and local laws on the books which could be enforced against those who misuse firearms. If enforced, this vast body of legislation would reduce the number of crimes involving firearms. Additional unenforced laws can serve no purpose, unless they are aimed at the law-abiding citizen who would dutifully register, license, and eventually surrender his firearms. The obvious potential dangers to the defenseless family are shown little concern by public officials and bleeding hearts who prattle on about disarming the criminals. Completely ignored is the warning of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. He pointed out in a newsletter to all law enforcement agencies that hoodlums and criminals will obtain guns regardless of gun controls. But the anti-gun fanatics seem immune to this sort of common-sense reasoning. By their twisted logic, whenever there is a crime involving a gun, it is not the person behind the gun who is guilty, but all the millions of responsible citizens who own guns. Hysterically they cry, "Americans are a violent people. We kill our public figures." But is such a condemnation of the 200 million people of this great nation really fair, or even accurate? Are these people vicious and violent as the anti-gun fanatics claim? Fortunately, the condemnations are not justifiable. Firearm homicides per 100,000 population have trended downward from a high of 6.3 per 100,000 in 1933 to 3.8 per 100,000 in 1967. During this 34-year period, the rate of firearm homicides have reduced by 40%, while the number of firearms owned by Americans has increased tremendously. That is not the kind of statistical comparison that anti-gun zealots care to hear about. Further analysis of these same statistics do show this disturbing fact. From a 2.4 rate per 100,000 for 1962, the index has increased each year to the present rate of 3.8 for 1967. We will not speculate as to the reasons for this recent trend upward. But it is interesting to note that during these same years, the attitude that criminals are just victims of society, to be protected, pampered, and preserved has become widespread and very evident in many court decisions and actions. The responsible, law-abiding citizen handles his firearms properly. The number of guns in the hands of such people has no connection with the number of murders and other crimes committed by criminals and insane persons who misuse guns. But for the sake of speculation, suppose a miracle occurred, and everyone, including criminals, turned in their firearms. Would this put an end to murders and other crimes of violence? Certainly not. And in fact, there would very likely be more murders and crimes, for the criminals would merely use hammers, knives, axes, firebombs. And these are but a few of the readily available weapons the criminal would be able to use against the law-abiding citizen who would now have no means of self-protection. Registration of guns is the demand most often heard today. When one looks at the idea of gun registration, actually turns the spotlight of reason on it, what does he see? Registration of guns can have no effect whatsoever in halting gun crimes, for a registered gun can be misused just as lethally as an unregistered one, and even the most hysterical anti-gun fanatic should be able to recognize this. But of course, once all firearms are registered, at least all firearms in the hands of honest, law-abiding citizens, the stage would be set for disaster. Following the murder of another public figure, the action demanded here could become a reality. Buried under an avalanche of propaganda, stunned and burdened by a false sense of public guilt, the American people might just possibly sanction legislation that would call in all the guns. Many people ask, why would so many of our lawmakers and so many well-known Americans be in favor of steps that could eventually render our citizens defenseless against the criminal forces? We feel most of them are sincere, but emotionally influenced, and to speculate further about their motives would serve no purpose. But as this recent cartoon shows, there is a segment of our society about whose motives for favoring gun restrictions there need be little speculation. The Second Amendment reads, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." Let us examine the other aspect of the citizen retaining firearms. The concept of a militia, an armed citizenry, rather than a standing army, was particularly appealing to the founders of our republic. To them, a standing army represented a potential source of tyranny and a threat to man's freedom. The Federalist Papers, written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, are acknowledged to be the most authoritative source available to us as to the thinking of those who drafted our Constitution. As Alexander Hamilton pointed out in Treatise 29 of the Federalist Papers, an armed citizenry was the only possible substitute for a standing army, and even more important, the best possible security against its misuse if it did exist. Our founding fathers made definite provisions for this right to keep firearms to be protected under the government they created. These men of vision and foresight knew that no government in a truly free nation need worry about the citizens being armed. They had the wisdom to look back in history and learn from the lessons it offered. Let us show that same wisdom and hopefully avoid some of the misfortune that has befallen other people in other countries. The sounds of the goose-stepping and Sieg Heils echo down the corridors of time, and the world still recoils from the horrors of the Hitler era. let us examine a little-known but crucial step that ultimately enabled Hitler to exert absolute power over the lives of the German people. Hitler came to power legally in Germany, riding on a wave of promises. Something for nothing to everyone, and a solution by the government for every problem. On March 18, 1938, the Hitler-controlled government issued new gun laws which required a permit from the government in order to possess a gun. As their applications for this permit were denied, the law-abiding citizens of Germany meekly and dutifully surrendered their firearms. The right to have a gun was thus taken away from the German people. As a consequence, those who would have resisted Hitler found themselves with no means to do so. Before such a fate could befall the American people, steps would have to be taken that would strip them of the means to defend themselves and their freedom. To those who will claim that such a thing could never happen in America, we say, read the restrictions to be placed on the American people in this bill submitted by Senator Joseph Tidings of Maryland on June 12, 1968. Among the many potentially dangerous proposals contained in this bill is Title IV, which declares, 1 year from the effective date of this act, no person shall possess any firearms or ammunition unless he shall have a firearms license issued by the Secretary of the Treasury or, pursuant to Title VI of this act, by the official designated by law of the state of which he is a resident. Are the American people ready to make their right to possess a firearm subject to the whims of politicians and bureaucrats? We hope not. Senator Tidings' bill will probably not become law, but the fact that it was co-authored by these 9 other U.S. senators, Brewster, Hartke, Javits, Mondale, Pell, Proxmire, Randolph, Smathers, and Young of Ohio, should be a matter of grave concern to all Americans. Their motives may be completely honorable, but the soundness of their judgment in this matter is certainly open to question. This great nation was founded upon a unique proposition, that the chains of restriction should be removed from the people and placed upon the government. The men who founded our republic created a system of checks and balances carefully calculated to preserve the people's freedom. The Second Amendment shows their realization that the final and best check on any government lies in the hands of the people. No greater check on any government intent on seizing absolute power can be devised than an alert and armed citizenry. For faced with a population determined to preserve their own freedom, no would-be tyrant would dare move. The Statue of Liberty holds high her torch of freedom. Freedom is passed from generation to generation, and each must be alert for signs of danger that would extinguish its fragile flame. We must stand ready and able, as did the men of Lexington and Concord, to defend our freedom if the need arises. Firearms and freedom. These terms are synonymous, for citizens who lose one will surely lose the other.